Entonces, bueno, vamos a dar inicio a nuestra tercera y última charla, que se llama Museos y Propiedad. Entonces, gracias por la paciencia, espero hayan el cafecito les haya calentado un poquito, las galletas, y nos den energía hasta las 2 que terminamos.
Okay, the last part, of course, the last part links with the discussions that we had and some of the ideas that I presented during the past few hours, but I now would specifically focus on this issue of ownership. What I said before and what I will say the coming hour is of course very much connected with this current decolonization debate. Especially in Europe and the United States, you have this debate on decolonizing museums and decolonizing everything. So this is very much connected with that, but I think it goes a little bit further. And I did not refer so explicitly to this decolonization debate because I have been to many meetings, conferences about this, and I noticed that to some extent the decolonization debate is hijacked by academics. There was one conference that some people from indigenous communities were complaining that academics were hijacking the debate, and I did not want to fall into this trap. So my perspective that I developed in my lectures was not very much an academic sort of perspective. I wanted to speak more from a museum practice sort of perspective. So if you came here for references to all famous French, English, American authors on decolonization, well, then I disappoint you. But in my practice, I became a little bit fed up with all these people from academia referring to Bourdieu, Foucault, Lyotard, and all these others, and they were again, and all these academics have never been in a museum or as a visitor have no idea what it means to work in a museum, to be responsible for a collection, for conservation. Just analyze all those highbrow publications, starting from Foucault and Bourdieu and Lyotard. It's not about the specific issues of conservation and restoration. And I think that has always been my purpose in life, well, at least, to look at how can we understand museum practice and develop new practices, perhaps, from there in interaction with stakeholders. And I made mistakes. I made so many mistakes. I can speak for hours about the stupidities I did in my professional life. Stupidities in my other life is something out of the topic. I worked, one of the museums I worked in the 1960s, 70s was a castle somewhere in the Netherlands. And it was the museum of a private collector who rebuilt the castle of his ancestors, and he made a collection which was partly a decorative art collection and partly a collection documenting the history of his family, he being the last of an old noble family. And after he died, it was made turned into a public museum, and in this public museum we, as assistant curator at that time, we had of course the responsibility to take care of that but not just the conservation of the collection, but also the interpretation of the collection. So what was the collection? What did the collection represent? Was it a decorative art museum, or was it a sort of biographical museum? And how to perhaps reshape the collection from a sort of museological perspective. And then I made a mistake. My first experience in deaccessioning was removing these objects from the collection. And that, I think, is the core of what I would like to speak about. Because what was our responsibility? And what was the right that we have to change his biography? Or at least to manipulate his biography. But that's what happened. Yeah? These photographs that we found somewhere were part of his biography. But we did not, at that time, well, the board, we found it quite funny, but still the board wanted to manipulate his biography by manipulating the collection. And why did we do that? It gives us the right to do that. But I think that was an interesting sort of, well, key moment in my life, which has influenced everything that I did. Because to whom belongs this collection? Not just in legal terms. Did this collection now belongs to the foundation? Did the collection belongs to the curators? Or still, did this collection still belong to the man who collected it? He was dead, but was he a stakeholder in some way or another? And how to recognize that stakeholdership? This is more recent, but basically the same. You know? Who owns this collection? This is two elders from a community somewhere in Mexico, I think, and it's the Ethnological Museum in Berlin, the Humboldt Forum. Yeah? And the Humboldt Forum, as the most important ethnographical museum in Germany, is very proud. They say, we work with communities. And it's always the picture that you see. They work with communities. I don't know. I don't know. This is not how I feel that working with communities should be. Still, their heritage is alienated from them. Yeah? It's stolen from them, which is clear in this plastic covering. Yeah? Because it's the heritage of the museum, and you have adapted to the rules of conservation. And you can only touch it with plastic gloves, and you can only enter the storage protected like that. I must admit that in the past, the collection was poisoned to protect it against insects. So there's also another element to it, because you do not want to poison the intellectual owners of the collection. But it symbolizes this dilemma. So saying proudly, we work with communities, but what does that mean? The core term here is stewardship. I could not find a proper Spanish equivalent for it. I'm not sure when administration is the same as what in English meant stewardship. I had the feeling that it's not the same. But maybe there's something for the discussion. But stewardship is, I think, a very important term here. It's redefining this concept of ownership. We are not owners, we are stewards. We may, in a legal sense, own objects, but basically we have these objects, we maintain these objects in trust for the benefit of society and its development. This is a part of the present ICON code of ethics. And the last sentence, inherent in this public trust. Trust here means slightly different thing than as I used the term before, but it's the notion of stewardship that includes rightful ownership, permanence, documentation, accessibility, and responsible disposal, but in connection with sort of responsibility that you have and that you share with others. And then I'm speaking not just about legal ownership, that is too easy, but I speak more about intellectual ownership. So who decides about the interpretation? Who decides about the terms used to refer to the object? Who decides about using objects in an exhibition? Of course, there is a connection between legal ownership and intellectual ownership. It is all extremely complex, and you know a lot about it, you read about it, you heard a lot about it. And this is the archetypical case study, the marbles coming from the Parthenon of Athens, and here again, words matter. Are we referring to it as the Elgin marbles, or are we referring to it as the Parthenon marbles? It's also a kind of appropriation. It's a kind of, well, taking intellectual control of these marbles. The Elgin marbles is referring to the person who collected it or stole it. Well, the person, Lord Elgin, who took it from the Parthenon and brought it to England and ended up, as you know, in the British Museum. Parthenon marbles refer to the origin. But these are things that are very complex, because who then is the rightful owner? Who can decide about it? Is it the British Museum who is now having these marbles, and what role does present-day Greece play in this, and not to speak about the ancient Greeks as stakeholders. In Berlin, there is this Pergamon museum with the Pergamon altar showing how complex these issues are. It was collected from a town called Pergamon, which used to be Greek, Hellenistic, in Turkey. Well, what's now Turkey? Yeah? So, they're all stakeholders, but what stake counts more than another? The collector, the old Greeks, yeah? And the old Greeks who lived there, they, in historical times, they were removed, they were kicked out of the country. So the present Greeks living in Greece, do they have a stake? Are they stakeholders? And what is the role of the Turkish government? Because it's present-day Turkey, but it has nothing to do with Turkey, because it was built long before the Turks entered that part of the world. So what then is the stake of the Turks? Yeah? First they didn't even want to know about that. Now they think, well, tourism brings in a lot of money. So now suddenly they recognize this Hellenistic heritage and have adopted it as part of their touristic infrastructure. To show something of the complexity of what I mean actually by intellectual ownership, I have not an example from an indigenous sort of context, because I do not feel comfortable in that, knowing not too much, but I would like to share something of my own experience in Lithuania. for some years for some time, I had a professor, I was professor of museology in Vilnius, and so I got to know something of this very interesting country with its very complex history and its heritage. As you might know, Lithuania was once part of Soviet Union and became independent in the early 1990s. And in this process of becoming independent, they created an infrastructure to take care of the heritage of the church, the Roman Catholic Church here. The Russian had emptied a lot of churches because of their attitude towards religion, turning churches into museums, turning church heritage into museum heritage. And this new organization, the Church Heritage Museum located in this church you see on the picture, they are still in control of what to do with church heritage. And religious heritage is interesting because it has its different dimensions of ethics, use. Is a religious object, is a museum still a religious object or not? That's that sort of discussions. But here in particular, I would like to focus on this church in Vilnius, and in this church there was an icon. You can see the icon here. This icon was extremely popular with the population of Vilnius. It was their icon. And they prayed for it also in Soviet Russian time. So it was extremely important for them. But then this icon became part of this infrastructure of church heritage. So suddenly this icon was removed from the church as being heritage and was recognized by the curators of the museum as a very important icon, very important work of art. Because, as you know, the icons in the period of use, they are overpainted. So important icons have many different layers. And restoration of icon means that you remove these layers. And in the logic of the curators and restorers, it was important to trace the history of the icon and to find the most authentic, the most original appearance of it. Because they didn't like the left version. The left version was the version that was in the church. And then the restorers, curators, decided, nah, this is 19th century ugly, and we want to go back to this probably 15th century sort of icon. And I must admit, I think this is ugly, and the other one is beautiful. But who am I to decide about it? And now, in this idea of re-establishing relations between communities and their heritage, this restored icon is brought back in the church. And it's like these elders of this Mexican community. Is it really returned to the community? Is it becoming part of this community again? No, it's stolen from them. Without asking. And they stole it from them by removing the image that they loved. And many people had copies of it at home. That is the image they loved. People were not interested in this art historical fake construction. And because it is a treasure, it should be protected behind art. So it's also physically alienated from the people. But I think we should, well, it's obvious, especially in the context of today, but still, we should be more aware of what we are doing. And we should question our professionalism, because there's nothing wrong with professionalism there. Yeah? It's a handbook sort of professionalism. Very nicely restored, well researched, no problem with that. You know, it's the best research you can have about an icon. And the restoration, the best restorers worked on that. And now it's in the church, it's original context again, but well protected because of the climate conditions and so on. But still, this handbook professionalism is far back from what perhaps our contemporary interpretation of stewardship could or should be. Perhaps you have to look for other approaches that more respect what stewardship means and the interest of the owners as one key stakeholder. And again, you can make an inventory of stakeholders, but basically, remember what I said about changes in this one article of the Icon Code of Ethics from 1984 to 1986 to 2004, that suddenly the role of the communities of origin became an important element in understanding what the cultural meaning, the cultural value of objects. And so we are speaking now slowly of new forms of musealization, new forms of recognizing objects as heritage, but not in alienating these objects, as in this particular case, and bringing objects in museums. The last few years, I did a lot of work on these strategies of new musealization. And it links up with what is now, especially in Europe, a very important provenance research. More than ever, museums are investing in studying the provenance, the biography of objects, and identifying these stakeholders, and in the end, trying to find a way to value the role of the stakeholders. Another concept that became extremely important, mutual heritage or shared heritage. I come back to that. Then musealization, light, restitution, return, and co-curatorship. I come back to that with some sort of examples to explain what I mean by that. And again, I'm sorry, but again, a Natural History Museum. This one is the Natural History Museum in Berlin, with one of the biggest, if not the biggest, dinosaur skeleton ever found. Don't ask me for the name. In the past, it used to be referred to as a Brachiosaurus, but now it has another name. But the object is interesting because suddenly it became part of a public debate. In the newspapers, it was described how, in fact, the dinosaurs, the skeleton, is part of a colonization policy of Germany. It is in the museum because it was found in, nowadays, Tanzania. And so it was from a former colony. So it's very much connected with this colonial history of Germany, and even more so. And the local people were involved in excavating, in transporting these bones, fossil bones, to eventually in Berlin. The museum took this serious as part of responsibility, provenance research. They invested a lot. It's a huge project. The book was published, another conference was organized, and in detail this whole colonial history was revealed. A very interesting example of, as I mentioned before the break, of a natural history museum, certainly recognizing that every natural history museum is actually more a cultural history museum. A natural history museum is always about culture rather than about nature. Because a natural history museum is how we perceive nature and how we dealt with nature, how we excavated, how we killed the birds from the trees and so on. Yeah? So it's telling more about us than about nature. But what I think is interesting that although we have this beautiful book, if you visit the museum, there's no reference at all. In the museum you still have the skeleton, and it's giving you biological details about the skeleton, what this animal ate and how they moved and I don't know what, but nothing about this colonial history. And still there is a resistance among natural history museums to speak about a cultural dimension of their work and share it. Even there's a discussion that the museum doesn't want to have the discussion of Tanzania. And there are people in Tanzania that say, well, actually it's ours. We want to have it. Talking about colonialism, well, in the Netherlands, well, is one good example of what a colonial power did and how they could earn a lot of money from slave trade. Slavery was hardly discussed in Dutch museums and Dutch history books, and the whole concept of slavery was not connected with the concept of heritage. But now it's coming. Now it's coming, and now it suddenly is being recognized as a form of mutual heritage. It is heritage that the colonizers shared with the colonized. That is what the slave owners share with slaves. And interestingly, this, I'm always pointing at that, it's what I see, it's what you see, but it's the same. This is the house, the official house of the mayor of Amsterdam. And this house was donated to the city of Amsterdam by somebody who owned a lot of money from slave trade. So it's interesting that the mayor of Amsterdam is living in a house connected with slave trade. But nobody spoke about it. Now, recently, there is a reference to that history of it, and now we have guided tours in Amsterdam about the heritage of slavery, tours that are developed by and with the descendants of former people that were enslaved.